Hi everyone, happy to have you here with me once again. Welcome back. Today, as you can see in the title, we're doing a new kind of video that I'm really excited about, and that is sharing with you my palette usage through the year and separating each quarter to see the statistics. And I'm really excited about that. This video I saw in Steph's channels last year, so I'll leave her channel down in the description box in case you're interested. But yeah, the whole idea of this project or tracking system, I don't know how to call it, is to track how many times you use each palette in your collection through the year. And for that I have 5 categories: the palettes that in the quarter I didn't use at all, 0 uses, then 1 to 5 times, 6 to 10 times, 11 to 20, and finally over 20 times. It's kind of tough for me to recognize that so far I haven't used any palettes over 20 times, but I'm completely sure that once we get like to the second or third quarter, I'll have palettes that I have used over 20 times in the quarter. But yeah, in this video, since we're just over the first quarter, I'm going to be sharing only the numbers from the quarter because that's exactly the same than the amount of the whole year. But once we get to the second quarter, for example, I'll share the numbers for the quarter that corresponds, but also for the total of the year so far. I hope I'm making sense, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be even easier and more understandable once I start talking about the palettes. But first I need to tell you my total number of palettes right now. And right now I have 61 eyeshadow palettes, and that's way too much, to be honest. I think at the beginning of the year I had like 42 eyeshadow palettes. If I'm not mistaken, I have brought in 17 new palettes in my collection, and I received all of them in March, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, the number has increased way too much, way too easily. But I'm not too mad because most of those palettes are smaller. For example, 6 of them are quads, so it could be worse. But yeah, my total number, my, how do you say it? Yeah, my total is 61. And now let's start talking about the usage on those palettes. Okay, let's start talking about the palettes that I haven't used at all so far this year, or at least in the first quarter, from January to March. There are 38 palettes that I haven't used in my collection so far this year. I know that sounds like a lot because it is a lot, but at the same time, I don't feel that bad about it because, as I said, I think I brought in 17 palettes in March. Well, I didn't buy all of them in March, but I received them in March. So that means that before March, like counting the palettes that I had before March, there are 21 palettes that I haven't used so far. It's still a pretty high number, but it's way better than 38. And I'm pretty sure next quarter is going to be completely different because, as you're going to notice through this video, most of the palettes that I use quite a bit are palettes that I have in projects, especially in my Pandos eyeshadows. But what I'm doing this quarter is that every time that I'm not completely sure which palette I want to use, but I know that I want to use my Pandos eyeshadows shades, I decide to randomly select a palette from my whole eyeshadow palette collection and then deciding which shade out of my Pandos eyeshadows can go with that palette, and that way I'm using more palettes than last year. So yeah, 38 palettes that I haven't used at all so far. Okay, moving on, we can start talking about the palettes that I use 1 to 5 times, and we have 15 palettes in that category. It's way too much, and in average, out of those palettes, out of those 15 palettes, I use 2 shades in each palette in average. So yeah, that is pretty bad. There are 15 palettes that I have used so far, but I have only used 2 shades of them in average, as I said. So yeah, I'm happy that I used those palettes. But yeah, I'm not too happy about that. Okay, but moving on, we can start talking about the palettes that I use 6 to 10 times, and I'm going to show you those palettes so I can tell you why did I use them. It was because they were on a project. It was because I was feeling inspired for that palette. So yeah, we're going to start talking about that. So in the 6 to 10 category, first I'm going to tell you about, where is it? This palette over here. It's really reflective, so I'm going to turn it around. But this is my Revolution Soft Extra Spice palette, and this palette looks like this. It's a, oops, sorry, it's a pretty well known, it's a pretty well loved palette, as you can see. So far I have four pans in this palette, but I'm really sad to say that the only shade that I have used out of this palette this year is this one over here. I don't know if I said it, but this palette I used 9 times in the first quarter, and yeah, all of the 9 uses were using this shade over here. This shade I have in my A to Z project pan, and I'm trying to hit on this shade called Brownie for the letter B. So yeah, I've been really focusing in that shade. I'm not really happy about that. Maybe I could wait for this shade too to make a transition shade that is a little bit more neutral than the one that I have in my Pando's eyeshadows right now. But yeah, this palette needs more love. But to be honest, this is a palette that I've been thinking that maybe I'm ready to declutter. I don't know if I'm going to do that because for a really long time I really enjoy this palette. But now I feel like I have better stuff in my collection and I don't know how to feel about it. Right now I'm not going to do anything. I'll keep working in Brownie. But yeah, this is the first palette that I used 9 times. The next palette in the 6 to 10 uses category is my Beau Noir palette from Colourpop. I suppose that is how you pronounce it, to be honest. I'm not completely sure. Sorry, I don't speak French. Hopefully one day. But yeah, I'm really happy about this palette because I have used it 7 times so far, and this palette is not in any projects, and I'm really excited about that. Sadly, in this palette, I have only used 3 shades out of, and are the shades that are not in the palette because at some point, I don't remember, maybe 2 months ago, I put some shades of this palette into this magnetic palette to create a new color story to work on with my Pando's eyeshadows shade, and those are these 3 shades over here. These 3 shades I have used in total, like for the palette, 7 times, as I said, and I have used quite a bit this shade Melt. I don't know if you know, let me see. I don't think you can see it because this camera doesn't like to focus in anything that is not my face, but I have quite a big dip on this shade. I mean, I'm really excited about it because, as I said, most of the times that I'm focusing on a shade, it's because it's in my Pando's eyeshadows. But this shade, every time that I reach for this little palette over here, I feel like this is the perfect transition shade for me. It's the perfect color. It's just a little bit darker than my skin tone. Actually, in the camera it looks quite a bit like my skin tone. I know it's a little bit darker, but yeah, you can see how similar it is to my skin tone. Today I'm not wearing any foundation or anything, just a little bit of blush. But yeah, I'm really happy. I hope that I get a pan on it, like a bonus pan, and that will be really, really exciting. The other 2 shades of that palette, as I said, are these two. This one I have used quite a bit in conjunction with this shade, but this one, it barely looks used. And this is the other shade that I think I have used like 3 times or something. But most of the uses in my Beau Noir, it has been in these 2 shades over here because, as I said, it's a really good transition and deepen out shade. The next palette in this category is my Zodiac palette from BH Cosmetics, and this is one of the palettes that I have in my Pando's eyeshadows. So I'm pretty sure each time that I have reached for this palette, it's it was because I was looking to use this shade over here, Leo. This is the one that I have in my Pando's eyeshadows, but I'm happy to say that I have used other shades in this palette, not only this one over here, like it was the case in my Soft Extra Spice palette. I think the shades that I have used the most are these two. Well, this one is the one that I have used the most, definitely, but also the matte of Virgo and from Aquarius I have used quite a bit. I know I have used a little bit of Scorpio, I think, but yeah, most of the times I'm like reaching for this palette, it's because Leo, the shade in my Pando's eyeshadows, but I take the opportunity to use these two transition shades that I really like, to be honest. I don't know if I said that I have 4 or 5 palettes in my 6 to 10 category, but I only have 4. In case I said 5, I'm sorry. And the other one that I have in that category is my Mercury Retrograde palette. And again, this palette was on my Pando's eyeshadows. This palette so far I have used 10 times, and my goal in the shade in Pando's eyeshadows was using it 10 times. So I'm pretty sure again that each time that I reached for this palette, it was because I was reaching for this shade over here. But again, the same story. I know that I have used some other shades in this palette. For example, Libra, this shade over here, it's quite lovely. I like Crush over here, even if it makes me a little bit mad, because in the pan it looks like a cool tone brown, but in your eyes it doesn't look at all like the color in the pan, and it's kind of a purpley brown. Well, this looks more neutral. It doesn't look like it has purple on it. But well, this is a shade that was in my Pando's eyeshadow. Sorry for blinding you. And I can see some wear on it. It doesn't have pan, of course. I wouldn't have been able to hit pan on it in all the 10 uses. But it looks loved. And I like that because this is one, well, it was one of the newer palettes in my collection back in 2021. Now I have like 17 new palettes, so this palette is almost old in my collection. It is what it is. Okay, and now we can move on to the next category, the 11 to 20 uses, to 15 uses? To 20 uses, yeah. Okay, so the first palette in my 11 to 20 uses category is my Sweetest palette from Beauty Creations. This is my focus palette for the year, and so far I have used it 16 times in total, but so far I have only used 1, 2, 3, 4 shades in this 16 pan. I think it's 16, maybe 18 pan eyeshadows. This is a shade that I have in my Pando's eyeshadows because, as I said, it's my focus palette. There is no pan yet, but I feel like I cannot be that far away from the pan, or at least that's what I hope. Also, I've been using quite a bit Cotton Candy over here. This is a pretty nice transition shade. I'm using Sour too. This is a cream shade that is really useful to clean up after any messes that I made while I'm doing my eyeshadows. And this is a shade I was focusing on before I roll in Brownie from my Soft Extra Spice palette. I was using this shade to deepen out my eye looks before I roll in that shade. So lately I haven't been using it like almost at all. And I don't know if I said it, but in my 6 to no, did I say that? I don't think so. Let me go back to my 6 to 10 category. In average, in these 4 palettes that I show you, I use 4 shades in each of them. I'm hoping I'm making sense. In the 11 to 20 category, in average, I have used 6 eyeshadows in each of the palettes. So the numbers are getting a little bit better. In the first category, the 0 to 5, I use in average 2 shades. In the next category, 4 shades. And in the category we're talking about right now, we have used 6 shades per palette. Okay, moving on, we have the next palette is my Just My Luck. How it was that possible? I don't know. Okay, moving on, we have my Just My Luck palette over here. This is also in my Pando's eyeshadows, and again, if I open this palette, you can see that I have some shades missing here, and that's because they're in this palette that I already showed you. But I haven't only used those shades, I have also used this mint color a couple of times. But yeah, the shades that I have used the shades that I have used the most are Kiss My Ass and Act Natural over here. These two palettes are from that palette. So yeah, this palette, Just My Look, I have used 11 times so far, and I think all of those uses were because I was reaching for my Pando's eyeshadow shade. Okay, moving on, what do we have? I think we have my Se Fantastic palette. This is full with stickers because I didn't like the cover of the palette, so I decided to give it a fashion emergency, and this way looks way nicer, in my taste at least. And yeah, guess what? This was also in my Pando's eyeshadows. I was working in this shade over here, but I also used quite a bit these shades over here, like this squad. And I used a couple of times the mint colors. I think once I used a shade over here. But yeah, most of those, how many uses? 18 uses were using this squad over here. So yeah, not so good, and this is a palette that I would like to get more love on because this year it's turning 2 years old. So yeah, and the last palette in this category is my The Nudes Light palette, and this palette I have used 13 times, and I'm happy to say this is in my Pando's eyeshadows, but even before the Pando's eyeshadows I reached quite a bit for this palette. This palette looks like this, and I'm happy to report that I have used every single one of the shades in this palette. It doesn't sound like a lot because it's only a 9 pound palette, but yeah, I'm happy about that. And right now I'm working in this shade in my Pando's eyeshadows, but even when I'm reaching for that shade, I try to use other shades in this palette, so I'm not only focusing in this shade and rejecting the rest of the palette. So yeah, those are all the palettes that I have used so far this year. In total, I have used 23 palettes out of my 61 palette collection. That means that I have used 38% of my eyeshadow collection in the whole quarter. And remember when I told you how many shades in average I used in each palette? Okay, in the 0 to 5 category, as I said, I use 15 palettes, and in average I use 2 shades per palette. That means that in those 15 palettes I use, in average again, around 30 shades. In my in my 6 to 10 uses category, I had 4 palettes, and out of them I used 3.8, let's say 4 times each. That means that I use around 15 shades in those palettes. In my 11 to 20 category, I had 4 palettes, and in each one of them I use around 6 shades. That means that in the whole category I use around 24 eyeshadows. That means that in average, again, well, not even in average, I have used 67 pans of eyeshadow in my collection, and I have 883 pans of eyeshadow in my collection. That means that so far I have only used 8% of my collection. Like if I count the palettes, I have used 38% of my collection, but if I count each pan in my collection, I have only used 8% of it. And that's really bad, and that's why I don't need the 61 palettes. I don't know how to fix it because sometimes I think that what I should do is declutter some palettes. And to be honest, there are some palettes that I'm thinking to declutter, but I don't have anyone to give those palettes to. And I don't want to just toss away those palettes because that will be really wasteful. So yeah, that's my numbers right now. And this video it's already way too long, so yeah, those are my numbers. Hopefully next quarter it's going to be a little bit better. Let me know how many palettes do you have, and do you have any idea how many of those palettes have you used so far this year? Maybe you're tracking them as I'm doing, maybe you only have like an estimate. I don't know. Let me know. I'm really interested to know. But yeah, that's everything for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please consider subscribing. I will love that. And I hope I'll see you in the next one. Bye.